Hello and welcome to NAIFA Live. I'm your host, Zach Hewells. We have an awesome program for you today featuring Eleanor Johnson as our featured speaker. After Eleanor's presentation, she will be made available for a Q&A, so please stick around for that as well. And as always, to kick us off, we have John D. Richardson from NAIFA, Tennessee with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks so much, John. And now we're going to go over to NAIFA President Larry Holzberg with some NAIFA announcements.
Hello, NAIFA Nation. I'm thrilled to be this month's host for NAIFA Live. If we haven't met, I'm Larry Holzberg, your 2022 NAIFA President and loyal member of NAIFA since 1990. Before we get going with today's NAIFA Live, I want to spend a few minutes talking about NAIFA's advocacy programs and why now, more than ever, it's time for you to get involved if you've never been, and why we need you to lead other members to get involved if you already participate. First off, NAIFA is the only association that has a professional lobbyist and grassroots team in every state. We coordinate and share our experiences across all 50 states because more and more, where we see one state propose a piece of legislation, we are soon to see another state introduce similar legislation. When that legislation is favorable to our business and our consumers we serve, this is great, and we can be a voice to amplify what's good in the bill. However, when legislation is introduced that could hurt our business, how we practice, and the consumer, our coordinated state advocacy programs serves as an early warning detection system to allow us to mobilize and combat legislation that would harm producers. Let's take a recent win as an example. A bill was introduced ostensibly to eliminate income tax in Kentucky by putting a 6% tax on financial services. NAIFA Kentucky quickly saw how harmful this bill would be and was able to mobilize its grassroots efforts to modify the bill and explain to legislators why this approach would be harmful to professionals in financial services. With a track record now of success in one state, we are ready to mobilize quickly when a copycat bill pops up in the next state. It's never been easier to get involved in grassroots advocacy and supporting NAIFA PAC. Right now, you can take a self-paced online course. It will take you through grassroots training at the 101, 201, and 301 levels, from the absolute beginning to advanced advocacy, so that you build confidence and can put it into practice. In fact, after you finish all three levels, you get a digital badge that you can put on LinkedIn and will show on our Fund and Advisor search on our consumer site at www.financialsecurity.org. A lot of people also aren't aware that our consumer search also powers the Find an Advisor search on lifehappens.org site and the search on Alliance for Lifetime Income, a consumer-facing group that promotes the advantages of using annuities and retirement plans. All efforts we undertake together to advocate on behalf of consumers to keep our risk protection products accessible and available to Main Street Americans. I want to end with one last note on advocacy efforts, and it's our work at the federal level. We know that we're going to continue to see tax challenges coming in from Congress as a way to pay for the pandemic. We know that there will be changes to our elected officials who are in Congress, and we know that our profession as producers continues to be misunderstood and oftentimes under attack. This is why it's even more critical that we come to Washington, D.C. this May and join us in going to Capitol Hill to directly meet with our legislators and their staff to talk about the value of what we do in our noble profession. There is frankly nothing like congressional conference, and I want to make sure that every member knows that they are not just invited to attend, but that your presence with us is sorely wanted and needed. When we stand united as producers and financial services professionals with hundreds of people on the steps of Capitol Hill, we send a very clear message. Our profession is valuable and we are critical in protecting more than 90 million Americans. So seriously consider making the trip to Washington, D.C. next month. Join me on May 23rd and 24th for an event that you can come back and use in your marketing to your clients and prospects. Proudly tell your clients that advisors that take action on behalf to make sure that the products and services that you are providing will be protected and available for a long time. If you have any questions or want to connect for any reason, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. You can always contact me directly or send me an email to naifapresident@naifa.org and we can schedule time. I thank you for your membership and for your service to this great association. Now, with no further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our April NAIFA Live speaker, Eleanor Johnson.
Thank you, Larry, for that warm introduction. My conversation today is called The Conversation Before the Conversation. And what we're trying to share with you is a very non-threatening way to engage a client and their centers of influence in a fruitful planning conversation so that we quickly understand what's important to them, what their priorities are, what assets they have to work with, so we can make the proper recommendations for them. So why do we have this conversation? Well, have you ever had a situation where you put together a financial plan for a client and as good as you thought it was, and as much on target as you thought it solved the problem that you were told that you needed to solve, the client didn't move forward? Or maybe they did, but it took months longer than it should have. Or a year later, they forgot what they did. Well, my premise is that outcome is often predictable. And part of the reason it happens is because we often use language that's confusing to the client. It's based on our own background, our own experience, our own acronyms, whether you're a CPA like I am, or an attorney, or an investment advisor, or an insurance person, we all have our own experiences. So what if instead we took all the acronyms out of that conversation and we had a quick level setting conversation at the beginning of every engagement with the client, or every time a new center of influence or member of the team joins, so we can all be on the same page? That does a lot of great things. So what does it do? First of all, what that level setting conversation does is it helps us quickly fact find. I find it as a very dynamic way to get a lot of information very quickly to really understand what's important to that client. And mind you, you may have already thought you got all the information, but it's a really good way to test that the information that you have been told about or that you've researched is actually true. It also allows you to focus your recommendations on the things that are most important to that client. Now, almost every time I have this level setting conversation, we also uncover opportunities that we didn't even know that were there before. They could be opportunities for insurance sales. They could be opportunities for more assets under management or other complex planning. And most rewarding is that the client becomes engaged. They actually become the driver of that conversation. They'll help tell you, you're giving them the power to articulate what's important to them, what their priorities are, what they want to fix, what planning things they want to fix. And then better yet, a year later, 2 years later, they'll remember why you did the planning that you did. And if they forget a detail because it's complicated, you can easily bring them back to remember what it is you're trying to accomplish. So what I'm going to do today is share with you this level setting conversation. It's just a little bit over 2 minutes. And then I'm going to tell 4, 5, maybe another half of a story that really help demonstrate how this conversation is used in practice. So it goes like this. I think about assets differently. I think about assets not based on what they are, but based on what they're for. And no matter how complicated they are, how simple, no matter how large or how small, you can put those assets into 1 of 3 buckets. The first bucket are the things that you use, touch, and enjoy during your lifetime, and the assets that generate that lifestyle. And of course, it's important to fill that bucket to capacity beyond, because you've worked really hard your whole life and you never want for anything. I call that your lifestyle bucket. Your second bucket is your risk bucket, everything that can go wrong for you or someone that you're responsible for, just in case I get sick, just in case I need a new roof, just in case something bad happens to an asset in that first bucket, like the value of the stock market drops suddenly for some reason. Now, once your first bucket's totally full, doesn't mean it can't be improved upon. Very intentional language, by the way, because we're working on that really probably for most of your clients, for their entire lives. And once your second bucket is totally full, doesn't mean it can't be optimized. Again, intentional language, because sometimes there's risks in there that your client might be somewhat aware of, and they either don't fully understand them or they tend to self-insure. And if we can put some guardrails around those risks or mitigate them, that frees up assets for other things. So once your first bucket's totally full, doesn't mean it can't be improved upon. And your second bucket's totally full, doesn't mean it can't be optimized. If there's $1 left over, even one, you may not have thought of it this way before, but by definition, that's an asset that you're never going to use during your lifetime, bucket 1. Even in the worst case, bucket 2, it's really for someone or something else. Could be kids, could be grandkids, could be charity. And once we understand what those assets are specifically and who they're for and perhaps even what format we want them to have it in. If I can take those assets, reposition them, re-entitize them, move them around, call them something else so they're worth more in the hands of those they're meant for, that's the essence of wealth transfer planning. Now, notice I didn't say estate planning. Why? Because for a lot of people, estate planning connotates taxes, and this is not necessarily tax driven, although it can be. And so really, it's really a matter of repositioning those assets so that they're worth more for whoever they're meant for. So our journey, our conversation for planning starts with understanding what assets are in what bucket, where the planning gaps are, what that client's actual priorities are. What are the things that keep them up at night? What do they want to fix first? What do they care enough about to fix and want to fix? And that's where we start. What assets we have to work with. And then based on that, we're able to make very specific recommendations that make sense for the client to solve the problems they want to solve in the timing they want to solve it with the assets available, as opposed to all the other strategies that we might throw at them that have nothing to do with them that end up leading to confusion. So that's how we start. So now, of course, we're here to talk a bit about insurance, right? So what are the insurance opportunities here? In your lifestyle bucket, insurance opportunities would include, retirement funding, college funding, anything that you can use to help accumulate money to make sure you have everything all the way to and through retirement. These may be overfunded life insurance products. They might be whole life, it might be annuity products to assure that you're going to have assets that don't run out during your lifetime. Risk bucket, well, that's all your classic things, right? This is all your classic casualty insurances in here. P&C coverage, health insurance, medical malpractice, liability coverage, income replacement, long-term care fits squarely in this bucket. If you have a business succession planning will fit in this bucket, key person coverage, and sometimes even strategies fit in this bucket, like a spousal ILET. Spousal ILET is a container to hold insurance that if you need the assets during your lifetime, tips back into bucket 1. But if you don't need it, it tips over to bucket 3, the legacy bucket. And then finally, that legacy bucket, this is where all the maxes are, right? This is if you have a client that has an annuity, for instance, that they purchased for the purpose of retirement planning, and they have more than enough in that first bucket now and will never need that annuity, and their intent is to give it to their children or grandchildren, we know that that's not an efficient asset. It carries with it extra taxes. And so the annuity max strategy can be a very effective thing for that client. Your annual gifting, your lifetime gifting, multi-generational trusts are clearly there. And there's a lot of planning. We're seeing a lot of clients that have done a lot of planning there over the last couple of years. And now is a great opportunity to enhance that plan and to solidify it and to add some layers of diversification and protection and security that we can use with insurance products. And of course, all sorts of charitable planning works in there as well. So let's start now with some of our stories. The first story, and by the way, these are all real life stories. Some of them sound rather large, but they apply, in smaller amounts as well. And they're really intended to illustrate, how you might use this 3-bucket level setting conversation in your own practice and apply it yourself. So the first one is a situation where I was referred in to a client by a financial advisor, and he said, Eleanor, I've got this client and they are a slam dunk estate planning client. They have a taxable estate, and I think we have an opportunity to work together and sell them some life insurance. Sounds great, right? So yes, the truth is this is a client that is worth $40 million. So he clearly is in an estate tax situation. But let me give you a little bit more information. He's 50 years old, and 38 of that $40 million is in his closely held business. So what do you suppose is keeping him up at night? Do you think it's giving things away to mitigate his estate tax liability for his kids? Or do you think it's something else? Well, the truth is he was worried about his own lifestyle, his own retirement. And this is what he was going through his head. It's like, okay, I've got this business. It's grown. It was a manufacturing business. It's surprisingly grown over these years. It's worth a lot of money now. I don't really have a lot outside of the business other than the home and a little bit of investments and not much really. But what does that mean for my retirement? Well, right now I'm making a good living And what's happening is I'm getting the money from my business. So I can keep doing that. I can keep working in the business, all the way to, for my entire lifetime. But what if I can't? Or what if I don't want to? So that's a problem. Well, what if I sell the business? What if I have a liquidity event? Well, certainly, if I have a liquidity event and I have $40 million that pops in, that will fill up my first bucket, right? Well, of course it will. But there was no known buyers on the horizon. So he's worried about that. How would that really work? How would that really play out? Another thought, yeah, I've got key people, those guys, they've been with me for a number of years. Maybe they can run the business for me. But when you think about it, we hear this all the time, right? When you think about that, he wasn't convinced that those key people could run the business so much more effectively than he did, that they could pay him and run the business and pay themselves. That's a lot of leverage. Like, they do that to borrow money, or you've got to be either make a lot more money, within the business, or they got to borrow money. That's a little risky. So those are the things that going through his mind that were keeping him up at night. So long story short, we kind of vetted a lot of opportunities. He'd already maxed out all of his qualified plans. He'd done everything that was deductible. But what we did discover is that there was some embedded retained earnings inside of that business, that closely held business. And left alone, it would result in a negative tax consequence and excess accumulations earnings tax back then. And so the thought was, why don't we, because we basically have all of our eggs in one basket in this business right now, why don't we take out some of those assets that, they otherwise would cause a bad tax result, and pull them out and put them into a vehicle that's not deductible, but that he owns and controls, that accumulates in a tax advantaged way, that he can access in a tax advantaged way when and if he needed it for retirement, that ultimately paid tax-free to his kids, his family. Would that be interesting? Yes, it was. What was that? That was just life insurance, right? In this particular case, it was a variable life insurance policy. And our plan was to put $1 million a year into this policy every year for 5 years and let it sit there for a bit. And then later on, pull money out for retirement that would supplement his retirement. And of course, continue with other business succession planning and that sort of thing. So we kind of had it all handled. Well, this worked out really well. The client was very excited. They were on board about it. And they went, immediately under underwriting. We got the whole thing done in a pretty quick time frame. Oh, there's one more thing. I like to share the mistakes that I've made over the years so that you might not make the same ones. I asked along the way, George, should your wife be involved in this conversation? And what do you suppose the answer was? No, I make all the decisions. That was a mistake. I shouldn't have done that, right? So off we go. We get the underwriting done. It was a little bit complicated. You had some health issues, a little cholesterol stuff going on, a few other things. And, but we got it done. Got it policy issued. And the financial advisor said, hey, Eleanor, this was such a great experience. You don't need to come in and you don't need to fly out to deliver the policy. We'll do it ourselves. No problem. I said, great. Then I got a phone call. Back in the day before Zoom. And if you can picture a conference room with a conference phone in the middle of the table. And they said, Eleanor, Peggy's here. And I said, oh, okay. Well, who do you suppose Peggy was? The wife, of course, right? You could hear the fear in the room. They said, Eleanor, Peggy has a question. I said, great, what's your question, Peggy? And she said, what happened to our $1 million? Great question. And I said, well, Peggy, you still own it and control it. We didn't irrevocably give this away like you would with estate planning. She goes, I want to do estate planning. I said, hold that thought. But in this case, your husband wisely understood that because all of your net worth was really tied up in this closely held business, that it didn't make sense to do estate planning before he made sure that your financial future, yours and his together, was secure, and that you had plenty of assets to live off of comfortably in the lifestyle that you're accustomed to all the way to and through retirement as long as you're alive. And so what we did is we recognized that there were some assets in the business that had some negative tax consequences. We pulled them out. We put them into an asset that you own and control, that accumulates in a tax advantage way, tax deferred way, that you can pull out in a tax advantage way as you need it, that ultimately paid income tax free to the beneficiaries. She said, beneficiaries? I said, yes, this is life insurance. She says, who are the beneficiaries? I said, you are and your daughter, Paige. She says, well, what does that mean? I said, well, this is a different kind of product. We didn't buy as much death benefit as possible, like we would per dollar of a contribution, like we would with estate planning. Instead, we bought the least amount of death benefit as a wrapper around these set of investments so that they would accumulate in a tax advantage way. And our goal really was accumulation for your retirement. But what it does mean is if your husband doesn't lose a few pounds and get his cholesterol in order, and yes, there's a story here, you're still going to get the retirement benefit. You're just going to get them early and in a lump sum. Yes, I really said that. Are we done? Yep, we're done. Basically, everyone was happy. Off we went, signed the paperwork. But of course, my stories have twists and turns, which you will find out. 6 weeks later, I got a phone call from the financial advisor. The financial advisor called me on a weekend in a panic, and he said something about a plane. And basically what happened is the financial advisor, the client, and 3 of their friends once a month would do these cross-state bicycle treks. And they would get to the starting destination of this bicycle journey via the private plane of the insured, who was the pilot, which we did know, by the way. We knew that he was a pilot. But this particular Saturday, an extra gentleman arrived, to go on the bicycle trek. And they wisely decided that there was too much equipment for the plane. So they drew straws. The financial advisor I was working with threw the short straw, which meant he got to take the equipment, the bikes, all the bikes and all the stuff, put it in his wife's van and drive to meet them at the beginning of their bicycle trek. And that particular Saturday, they beat the plane. He beat the plane. His friend, the client, the insured, and those three other buddies all perished in a tragic airplane accident. Now, a few weeks later, I delivered a $15.3 million death claim, 176,343% rate of return. We talk about rate of return all the time on death, right? When we talk about life insurance, obviously no one wants to get your rate of return that way, do you? But here's the deal. Life insurance as a particular type of asset is the only asset that when things go horribly, terribly wrong is there. It has that self-completing aspect so that it pays off in those early durations, even if it happens right away. It's the only thing that does it right away, that gives all the rest of the planning time to get to fruition. And so it's why I'm very proud to be in this business. And I'm very proud of all of you for the things that you do for your clients and the fact that you're willing to have these conversations with them because it's important to them and their families. So what did I really do that day? Did I just deliver a check? It's not what it is, it's what it does, right? So what does life insurance do? In this case, we saved that family business. We saved 125 jobs in that rural community. They built a park in his honor, and ultimately his wife did get to do her estate planning. So, second story. Okay, so for this one, this is another situation, end of sad stories here for a bit. So this is another real life situation where I was working with a private bank and they had a client referral from an attorney. And the attorney says this client needs $30 million of 10-year term. And it was for a very specific reason having to do with her citizenship and some things going on. We won't get into any of that. But basically, we got it done. $30 million of 10-year term. It was a little complicated because of her citizenship and her travel and all that stuff. We got it done. And then I met with her and her CFO in a coffee shop in Hillsborough, California. And I said, this is a little different engagement than we normally do. She says, what do you mean? I said, well, normally I ask more questions. She says, well, what do you ask? I said, well, I talk about buckets. She goes, that's interesting. What does that mean? I said, well, I think about assets and wealth a little differently. I think about assets not based on what they are, but based on what they're for. And no matter how complicated or how simple, no matter how large or how small, you can put those assets into one of 3 buckets. First bucket are the things that you use, touch, and enjoy during your lifetime, and the assets that generate that lifestyle. And it's important to fill that bucket to capacity and beyond. So you have everything you need all the way to and through retirement. I call that your lifestyle bucket. Second bucket is your risk bucket. Everything that can go wrong for you or someone that you're responsible for. Could be kids, could be parents, could be yourself, your assets. And so that's your risk bucket. And once your first bucket is totally full, doesn't mean it can't be improved upon. And your second bucket is totally full, doesn't mean it can't be optimized. If you have $1 left over, by definition, that's not an asset that you're ever going to use during your lifetime, bucket one. Even in the worst case, bucket two, it's really for someone or something else. Could be kids, could be grandkids, could be charity. And once we understand what those assets are and who they're for, and perhaps even what form we want them to have it in, if I can take those assets, reposition them, re-entitize them, move them around, call them something else so they're worth more in the hands of those they're meant for, that's the essence of wealth transfer planning. Now, your attorney specified that you had a $30 million hole in that second bucket, and we've just filled it. Congratulations. So that's great. What happens after 10 years? I said, well, the house didn't burn down, but you still bought the fire insurance. You're still alive, which is, of course, what we want, but no, you don't have life insurance anymore. And she said, isn't the premium $70,000? I said, yes, it is. Every year? Yes, it is. She goes, well, that's $700,000. I said, I know. And she said, so I'm going to pay $700,000 and not get anything back for it? I said, well, that would be true. But as the attorney specified, we had this hole, we filled it. That was a risk that we've solved for. Let me ask you a different question. If by chance you have any assets in that third bucket, then it's just a math problem. We can take a look at where those assets are currently being invested, and we can either reposition some of the income from those or the principal into an insurance policy that lasts your whole life, that solves your second bucket risk for the first 10 years, and after that is just an asset repositioning. It's basically a math problem. We'll compare it to what it's doing right now, and you'll never lose that money. She turned to her CFO right then and said, that's what I want. It's a third bucket risk. That's what I want. So we went that day from $30 million of 10-year term to $30 million of permanent coverage. Good result, right? Who's not happy with this scenario? When attorneys refer you to someone and ask you to do something specific, they like you to do it, right? So I knew that I had to go into the city and have a conversation with the attorney. And I made an appointment and did that the following week. And the attorney started out when I walked in the room like this, and within 10 minutes was like this. Thank God, he said. I've been trying to get them to do estate planning for the past 10 years, ever since her husband died. He became our biggest ally because he knew where everything was, including all those assets in that third bucket. And oh, by the way, it included a previously funded trust that was perfect given the situation, the very, very unique, specific situation for this client. It's already outside of her taxable estate, already made sense. And we repositioned those assets into a policy and paid for it in 1 year. So we went from $30 million of 10-year term to $30 million of permanent coverage that we paid for all at once. Now, a year later, I went back and met with her again, told her how smart she was because, you know, the pricing had changed. It would cost so much more money because she was older, product had changed. She remembered the buckets. She asked me to mentor her daughters. She referred me to her friends. Super simple situation, really overall less than an hour or so. And by the way, we had raving fan advisors, clients, centers of influence as well. Third story. Now, often you're going to have situations that are absolutely spot on estate tax situations, right? And so some of you are probably thinking, for my clients that have a taxable estate, I'm certainly not going to talk about buckets because that's just beneath them. Well, let me ask you this. Do wealthy people care about lifestyle? And the answer is yes. And so I think it's critical to have this level setting conversation because unless you do, everything you do from a planning standpoint, in the back of their mind, they're thinking first bucket expense, not third bucket asset repositioning. If you have the level setting conversation, you can get to that point much quicker and you can address the unsaid objective that often will either kill a deal or slow down the planning process or make it never happen at all. So in this particular case, I had a client another financial institution. This particular institution had a group of wealth planners that did, these detailed plans for a client, and they determined that this particular client needed $20 million of liquidity for estate taxes, and they really, really needed it, right? So the idea was we need to buy $20 million of life insurance to create the liquidity, put it in a trust so that it can, be there to pay estate taxes. Simple, right? And so the advisor call and what happened is they had worked with someone else who somehow confused them, didn't seem objective, something, but they kicked him out. And I got the phone call saying, hey, Eleanor, would you please come and fix it? And oh, by the way, I want you to make sure you look at all the carriers. I want to look at individual and survivorship, look at every carrier out there. I want it's 10 pays and full pays. And I want, and I want to do premium financing and installment sales to defective trusts and grantor loans and blah, 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 blah. Okay, so typical, I want it all, I'm going to throw it all at the client request. I said, let's instead have a conversation. So I did the pre-meeting, and then we scheduled a meeting with the client and the advisor a couple of weeks later. So it was on a Tuesday. They specified this third bucket, right? So it was on a Tuesday, and the meeting was supposed to start at 10:30. I got there at 10:20, check in at the front desk, and they say, oh, they're already here. They're back in the office with Fred. I said, that's great. And so I said, are they actually in the conference room? I go, no, they're in the office. So I go back down the hallway to Fred's office. He's sitting with his back to the window, his big desk in front, client sitting right in front of him, her husband to her right, empty chair to the left. So bad seating. Always remember, when you have centers of influence, they should be seating next to your client if you're making a presentation of them. And apparently he'd been telling them for the prior 20 minutes exactly what I was going to tell them. And he sees me through the window and he goes, there she is now. The wealth planner says you need $20 million of life insurance for estate taxes. And I know you don't like life insurance, but I bet you hate estate taxes even more. And you know what? I know you don't like life insurance people. I don't really either. We really hated the last guy, but you have to buy the insurance, even though you don't want it. And I don't really like life insurance either, but you have to have it, because in this case, you're really in trouble if you don't. And, the last insurance guy, he was a disaster, but, Eleanor is better than most insurance people. So I brought her in here because I want her to tell you that how much exactly this life insurance costs, how expensive it is, was his comment. And I go, so I'm sitting there. She turns to me and she says, okay, how expensive is it exactly? Not the way you want to be introduced, right? How expensive is the insurance that we don't want, that you need to sell us? Now, what are they thinking? Expense, right? First bucket. So instead, did I have those pricing, by the way? I had spreadsheets with me. I could have answered the question, but instead I said this, I'm not sure. There's so many ways to structure this. Do you mind if we take a step back? And as a level setting conversation, if I share with you the way I think about wealth and assets, because it's a little bit different. And that's a good way for me to get to know you better and you to get to know me better. By the way, they never say no when you ask them if you'll do that. I think about assets and wealth a little bit differently. I think about assets not based on what they are, but based on what they're for. No matter how complicated or how simple, no matter how large or how small, you can put those assets into one of three buckets. First bucket are the things that you use, touch, and enjoy during your lifetime, and the assets that generate that lifestyle. It's important to stuff that bucket to capacity and beyond, because you worked really hard your whole life and you never want for anything. I call that your lifestyle bucket. Second bucket is all the things that can go wrong for you or someone that you're responsible for. Could be kids, grandkids, parents, and could be an asset in your first bucket. So once your first bucket's totally full, doesn't mean it can't be improved upon. And your second bucket's totally full, doesn't mean it can't be optimized. If there's $1 left over, even one, by definition, that's not an asset that you're ever going to use during your lifetime, bucket one. Even in the worst case, bucket two, it's really for someone or something else. It's your legacy bucket. Could be kids, could be grandkids, could be charity. And once we understand what those assets are, and who they're for specifically, and perhaps even what form we want them to have it in, if I can take those assets, reposition them, re-entitize them, move them around, call them something else, so they're worth more in the hands of those they're meant for, that's the essence of wealth transfer planning. Now, Am I to understand that you're the last in a generation of multi-generational dynasty trust? Yes. What does that mean? That means at her death, there's a taxable termination, which, by the way, is the reason she needed the liquidity. There's going to be at least a $20 million tax hit when she died. Am I also to understand that your parents died prematurely? I'm so sorry. What does that mean? That means that she's a full generation older than everyone else at her level in this trust, which means the probability of her having that taxable termination and that liquidity need first was really high, which is not good, right? So what percentage of this trust do you have? 5% is the answer. You go, that's interesting. How does the governance of that work? By the way, what's 5% mean? That means that kids had kids had kids had kids, right? So there's a lot of people involved in this trust. It's multi-generational and it kept going, right? So she has 5%. How do the governance of this work? And I let her talk for 20 minutes about, she goes into the city. It's all big city real estate, commercial real estate, how they didn't know what they were doing. They weren't doing things right. And she told them and she's fixed it and blah, 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 blah. Okay, great. That's amazing. You can have that kind of influence with 5%. You have 2 daughters, right? Yes. How much do they each get? 2.5%. Okay. So could they go into that same meeting and have that same influence? She kind of looked at me. I'm not sure. Okay. Let me ask you a different question. If they needed liquidity for any reason, and they took their 2.5% each, and they went to the meeting with all those other members of that multi-generational trust, and they said, you know, we would like to be bought out. We would like to exchange our 2.5% interest in the trust for 2.5% of the full fair market value of everything in the trust, and we'd like it in cash. How long would it take everyone else to come up with the cash equivalent of 2.5% of the fair market value of everything in that trust? And I let her sit on that for a second. She looked at me, she said, we're real estate people. I said, I understand. She says, well, if someone needs cash quickly, they need cash, you know, quickly, they're not going to get full fair market value. We're not going to pay them full fair market value. Remember, she's talking to our daughters now. I said, I understand. I said, let me ask you a different question. What if we reposition the cash flow that you're getting from this trust that's not funding first bucket lifestyle, even over stuff? We make sure there's plenty of, we figure out how much that lifestyle is, and you make sure it's fully full. The cash flow is generating that lifestyle, you know, based on our assumptions today, and maybe adding an extra cushion for safety. And what if we, you know, and then we also add some extra of that cash flow, and we consider our risk, our just in case money. What if we made sure those first 2 buckets were totally full, and we looked at whatever was left over in that cash flow, and we looked at the after-tax amount of that, and if we reposition that after-tax number into an asset that creates the predictable source of liquidity that your daughters will need exactly for them, exactly when they need it, would that be interesting? Well, yes, it would. What are we talking about? We're talking about life insurance, right? So we're just going to take the money she's never in her wildest dreams ever going to use, even in the worst case scenario, and take that after-tax amount and use that to buy the $20 million of insurance that helps them pay that liquidity. That's what we did. We already knew that number. I'd already done the pre-call, already knew the number. It was $256,000 a year. I knew that I could buy the $20 million for $256 a year, because my spreadsheets went from 176 to 313. So 256 I knew would work. She wrote the check. Do you think if I brought out spreadsheets at the beginning of the meeting, she would have written a check for $256,000? No way. A year later, she gets the premium notice and she goes, oh, this is really expensive premium. Remember, we're repositioning third bucket assets. We're not spending first bucket lifestyle. Oh, that's right. She wrote the check. So I'll segue for a second and just share with you another thing real quick. I did the speech I've done it several times to producer groups, to all sorts of things in the industry. And I had one gentleman who heard me and 6 months later said, Eleanor, I owe you a debt of gratitude. I said, why is that? He goes, I have a friend who I play golf with once a month, who's a great guy. And I asked him to do some planning, but at the end of the day, I couldn't get him to move forward and I didn't know why. So I shared with him this level setting conversation. I said, you know what, I heard this woman speak and she has this way of talking about framing the conversation that might help you understand why I've made these recommendations to you. And he did the bucket thing. And the client says, oh, you mean I'm not spending first bucket lifestyle, I'm repositioning third bucket assets? I can do that. It's $500,000 a target. You see, he was afraid to tell his friend that he was worried that that was too much of a hit on his lifestyle, when that's not what it was at all. It was a repositioning of third bucket assets. So yes, wealthy people care about lifestyle. And if you're lucky, they'll say, oh, that's expensive, but more often they won't. And then you won't know why you didn't move forward on the transaction. Okay, so I got a couple more in the time we have left. This one here, I'll go through rather quickly. This is a good example of how you can use this level setting conversation as a fact-finding tool. And so this is a situation where I had a financial advisor say, hey, as a favor to me, I have this client, he's a doctor. They make a lot of money, but have no net worth. So they're still filling their first bucket in our nomenclature, right? But I think they just bought it. She's pregnant with child number 2. They just bought another house. We just did their mortgage for them. And the only insurance he has is what he has at work. And I think he needs $1 million of term insurance. Will you come here and sell it to him? I go, sure. So I came in, they were late. She was, pregnant out to here, to stop a few times to use the restroom before they got there. He starts looking at his watch as soon as he gets in the door. The financial advisor says, hey, I know, I'm here because I'm worried about you. I think you need some more insurance other than what you have at work. And I think you need $1 million of term insurance. And Eller is here to tell you what it costs. Again, not the best way to be introduced, right? And they said, okay, but they knew why they were there. I said, okay, what's it cost? I go, before we go there, do you mind if I take a step back? We have a level setting conversation, share with you the way I think about wealth and assets, because it's a little different. That helps me to get to know you better, you to get to know me better. Do you mind if we do that? They never say no. Okay. I think, and I literally on the wall, in the conference room, drew 3 buckets. And I said this, I said, I think about assets and wealth a little bit differently. I think about assets, not based on what they are, but based on what they're for. And no matter how complicated or how simple, no matter how large or how small, you can put them into 1 of 3 buckets. First bucket, the things you use, touch, and enjoy during your lifetime, and the assets that generate that lifestyle. And I know that's where you're at. I know you're building that right now, but there's another bucket right next door, the risk bucket, all the things that can go wrong for you or someone you're responsible for, that if you don't pay attention to that bucket and something bad happens, it can impact your lifestyle and undermine your hopes and dreams. So that's why your advisor asked me to come in here and talk to you about this. Now, someday you'll have this 3rd bucket, which is everything left over after the first 2 buckets are totally full. Do you mind if we talk about your buckets? So we literally started filling buckets. How much do you make? How much do you spend? How much does she make? Tell me about how much you're putting away in your retirement account. He explained that he was how he max funded his SEP IRA. He's frustrated he couldn't put in more. How much more would you put in if you could? Another 20,000. Okay, great. Write that down. Ask. Is your doctor practice? Is it earn in or is it buy in? It's, what does that mean? I said, did you pay anything for it? I said, no, it's what happens when you leave. You just leave. And I said, well, do you get paid when you leave or do you, no? I said, well, what happens? What happens? And he goes, well, we've only had 1 person leave so far, but he was old. He was 50. Okay. So I said, what if we could somehow monetize that for you in the future that would help you with the retirement? Is that interesting? Yes, it is. And then we put that in the parking lot. Now, a lot of people would fall for, ooh, that sounds like a big transaction. I want to focus on that, but there aren't the right players in the room to do that, right? That's an opportunity, but not something to talk about now. So you put that in the parking lot as a future consideration. So ask. Do you have long-term care? No. Well, he's a doctor in an ER room. Have you ever run into, a younger person that needed long-term care? Yes, I do. Do you understand? Do you have disability? Yes, I already have it. So all the things, we recognize the gaps. Then I asked, where did the $1 million come from? What do you suppose the answer was? Amongst everyone. He says, I don't know. Financial advisor, I don't know. Sounded like a good number. Do you mind if we test it? So I took that Life Happens app, that we all love. And I said, okay, we have all the information on this board already about all these things except for 3 things. One is we've got 2 kids. Are we going to go to college? Yes. Public or private? And write that down. Financial advisor. What after-tax rate of return are you willing to commit to for the next 30 years? Write that down, right? Something happens to you, doctor, you get hit by the proverbial bus. How much income do we need to provide for your wife and for how long? Write that down. Push the button. Is it $1 million that pops out? No, it's 5. They're shocked. Okay, so there's levers we can play here, right? So kids, are they, we have them going already to public school, not private school. What about who should take them out of college altogether? No, then that's not a lever we're going to push, is it? Financial advisor, are you willing to commit to a higher rate of return? No, she wasn't, which leaves what? How much and how long? So right then and there, they changed how much and how long. Push the button, $4 million pops out. They're so relieved. Okay, so now let's go back. So now we need $4 million of coverage. You said that you're interested in putting more money into your SEP IRA. I can't give you another deductible option, but what if I could give you an asset that you own and control, not deductible, but we take it off the tax rolls. Own and control, that accumulates in a tax advantage way, you can access in a tax advantage way that ultimately pays income tax for your family. Is that interesting? Yes. So we did an overfunded, again, this happened to be, it could be an IUL or VUL. Back then I did a VUL product, and $20,000, bought $500,000 of insurance wrapper, got that done in a very short period of time. That leaves what? $3.5 million of coverage we still need. We wanted something that had some flexibility into it, but also had a long-term care rider. So we did a long-term, universal life with some flexibility, had some good long duration guarantees, had a great long-term care rider, wrote that. We did, however, buy some term insurance on her, for her, that was the $1 million term. So 45 minutes, term sale turns into overfunded VUL, $3.5 million of permanent coverage with long-term care rider, and $1 million a term on the wife. Whole thing got done within, some of it within 2 weeks, some of it within a few weeks, and a whole lot more revenue to the advisor and really solving what's important to that client. So that's the end of that one. So last story. This is real life client stories, more recent. I'm going to call this the tale of 2 brothers. These are 2 brothers that are successful sales executives, both healthy, both active, both, like I said, successful, both have great families. The older brother had a manufacturer's rep business. His wife, is amazing. They had 3 grown kids. They lived on the lake. Again, just a really great family and great life. Younger brother, he was kind of the salesperson, the guy who, was the captain of, or he's the guy that was this, the golf club champion. He was the softball coach for his only daughter. He was a swim team starter. For his wife, he was the person that really entertained her clients and made everyone comfortable. He's that guy that makes everyone comfortable all the time. Super social, super, beloved by all. Their approach to planning was very different. Older brother, really saw the value of some amount of life insurance, really didn't see the value of long-term care during his working years, thought that was something that you do when you're older. And so kind of declined the idea of doing that. And even kind of jokingly says, my wife was a nurse. She'll take care of me if I ever needed long-term care. It's kind of he said that in a joking way. Younger brother, his wife was the planning type, tended to be an insurance buyer, and he did whatever she said and only complained when he thought his perception of how much they were spending in insurance premiums was a little high. Now, fast forward, this would be in 2017. Older brother starts getting some strange numbness in his hands. Misdiagnosed initially, ultimately it turns out it's ALS. Younger brother actually had some different kind of issues. He had some memory issues. He had some attention span issues. He made some bad financial mistakes. started having some strange conversation. Every time his wife went out of town, he thought someone broke into the house. So there's definitely something going on. His wife had tricked him to go to the doctor. Ultimately, she was hoping for a brain tumor they could pull out. It turned out it was this thing called front temporal degeneration. It's sometimes called front temporal dementia. It's when the front of your brain's completely gone. It's when your brain, if you look at a PET scan, which is the color graphic of your brain, you see it shrunk and most of it's not working. And so they were lucky, got a diagnosis pretty quickly. And he went from a diagnosis to 3 months later, unable to give the father of the bride speech at his daughter's wedding. Within a month, it was not safe for him to be by himself. He almost burnt down the house. He ultimately did flood the house, but they brought in, because of the fact they had long-term care, they brought in initially day shifts for long-term care caregivers, and ultimately full-time living care after he flooded the house on his wife's watch. Older brother also, it turns out, had front temporal degeneration. Younger brother, turns out, also had ALS. So they both have that combo of FTD/ALS. Older brother, they dramatically downsized. His wife had to quit her job. She became his full-time caregiver. Younger brother, they had the caregiver that was there. And it wasn't hard. It wasn't ideal. I mean, it wasn't easy. It wasn't ideal. But at the end of the day, the family didn't have to do as much heavy lifting as the wife of the older brother had to do. And my point for telling you this story is just to remember that long-term care is not so much about the insured as it is about the family. That stress, the economic toll on family members is crazy. The stress is crazy for long-term care, and how it impacts family members. I mean, the stress is unreal, and how the impact on health and everything else. And I share this story with you because it's personal. Long-term care is real. I know a lot about this particular client. And by the way, if you want to know a little bit more about FTD, 60 Minutes has a piece on it. It's very short, but it's called The Cruelest Disease You've Never Heard of. It happens as early as in your 20s, and it goes as late as, it usually happens before 60 usually. So it's a younger source of dementia. This is Gary, and this is caregiver Lawrence. And I know a lot about this story because I am the wife of the younger brother. It's my husband, Gary. This is my story. This is our daughter, Katie, and her husband, Race, the one that he couldn't do the father of the bride speech for. And because of the coverage that we had, we were able to travel. I took time off of work. I took a few months off, and we really had the opportunity to choose joy. My sister-in-law, on the other hand, became that sole caregiver. She became the one that had to take care of him. She had to do the heavy lifting, literally. He spent a lot of time in bed at the end because it was just physically impossible for her to do a lot of things for him. And so I want you to think for a second, everyone on this call, you're successful financial advisors. I want to think about you and think about your clients. If 3 months from now, and these are people in their 50s, right? If 3 months from now you become completely disabled, which family is yours? Do you have enough coverage? Do you have long-term care? Do you have enough? Are you sure? It was $13,000 a month in the basic long-term care coverage, not counting, all the other expenses that go with it. Lawrence traveled with us. He, ate with us. He did everything as part of our family. So it was about $15,000 a month that we spent just, on keeping Gary going. Now, FTD ALS combo is kind of a deadly thing. You see here, Gary in his first year, by his second year, he was hunched over, and very shortly he couldn't walk, couldn't speak, couldn't go do anything. 2 years, 3 months after diagnosis, while we were traveling in Hawaii, he passed away in his sleep peacefully. But again, and we had a wonderful Hawaiian funeral with outrigger canoes that we went to. And so we were able to enjoy that together. This is actually Gary and the turtle. This is me setting it off to sea. And of course, all stories, and by the way, that was one of the first times that my sister-in-law had the opportunity to get away on her own as she came to the funeral. This is one of the first times she did. Her husband died a couple of months later, but she took some time off and came to the funeral in Hawaii. That was her first weekend away in a very, very long time. Now, not to be sad, all things keep going. So here we are a year later. They built a plaque in his honor, put a tree in his honor. And there's our daughter, was pregnant with our first grandson, who was born. Now he's a year old now. He's born in February, Mr. Kai James Kopak, KJ for short, which is the nickname that Gary called Katie for her softball team. Now, I don't tell you this story to make it sad, but just to say this. Dare to do the right thing for your clients. Dare to ask those questions. Dare to have that planning conversation, but you don't have to make it complicated. If you try to sell strategies and widgets, you're not serving your client as well as you could be, because you don't know what it is that you don't know. So try this out. Try having that level setting conversation as a tool to reframe that conversation. And amazing, magical things will happen. And it goes like this. I think about assets and wealth a little differently. I think about assets not based on what they are, but based on what they're for. No matter how complicated they are or how simple, no matter how large or how small, you can put those assets into 1 of 3 buckets. First bucket are the things that you use, touch, and enjoy during your lifetime, and the assets that generate that lifestyle. Call that your lifestyle bucket. And of course, it's important to fill that thing to capacity and beyond, so you never want for anything. But while you're building that, don't forget about the risk bucket, because if you don't pay attention to that, even while you're building your first bucket and things go wrong, can undermine your hopes and dreams. Now, once your first bucket's totally full, doesn't mean it can't be improved upon. And your second bucket's totally full doesn't mean it can't be optimized. If you have $1 left over, even one, by definition, that's not an asset you're ever going to use during your lifetime, bucket 1. Even in the worst case, bucket 2, it's really for someone or something else. Could be kids, could be grandkids, could be charity. And once you know what those assets are and who they're for, and perhaps even what form you want them to have it in, if I can take those assets and reposition them, re-entities them, move them around, call them something else so they're worth more in the hands of those they're meant for, that's the essence of wealth transfer planning. So our conversation really starts with understanding what assets are in what bucket, where our planning gaps are, what our client's priority is, so we know what things we want to solve when. And oh, by the way, getting to a perfect plan is, takes forever and is usually not possible because things keep changing. But you can quickly get to the first 80% and then go back for another 80%, and then you can end up at 96%. So do these things in tranches so they make sense, and they're bite-sized pieces for your client. You're going to serve them much better. And if you do this, if you have this level setting conversation, great things will happen. It's a more efficient way to fact find. You're going to get more information from your clients more quickly that you can, of course, put into your other fact finding tools later on, your other planning tools later on. But the trick is it allows you to focus on the recommendations most appropriate to the client and the needs they want to solve. You're also going to uncover opportunities that you didn't even know were there before, much more often than initially anticipated. And finally, most importantly, you got clients that become engaged. They become the driver of the sale. They'll help them articulate what they want, what their planning gaps are, what's important to them, what they want to solve, right? What are the problems they have and what do they care enough about to solve? And they'll remember, because we haven't used so many acronyms, because we made this simple, a year from now, 2 years from now, they'll remember. And if they forget some detail of it, it's very easy to bring them back with this level setting conversation. So I encourage all of you to do this. I didn't ever plan to be the poster child for the value of planning. And I am, even though that wasn't my intention. I can just tell you from a consumer standpoint, what you do for your clients is so important. Please make sure that you do that for them and for you. And as a follow-up, for those that would like it, I do have a audio clip of this quick level setting conversation that you're welcome to ask me for. You send me your V card with your full contact information and your phone number, your cell phone to this NAIFA, with NAIFA Live to my cell, and I'll send that off to you. And it's courtesy of John Hancock, who I worked for a few years, that allowed me to continue to offer this for all of you. It doesn't have my name on it, but you're welcome to have it. Thank you.